Hello, everybody, and welcome to Positive Fandom. I'm your host, Mmmm, and of course, we are reviewing Horatio Hornblower here, Season 1, Episode 6. Couldn't do it without Darth Plato here reviewing the episode with me. How are you today, Darth Plato? Can you hear? Oh, how are you today?
And my sound just up for a moment. Yeah, I can hear you. I'm fine. Thanks for having me on. It's been a while, and it's good to be back on the It Show.
It is great to have you back. I have been away, and then I had to change my schedule and all sorts of stuff. So we're going to be doing our historical show at this time every Thursday, guys. Darth Plato and I have a lot to cover coming up. We're going to be doing reviews here on Positive Fandom and on the Burnettwork coming soon. So, guys, do make sure that you're sticking around for that. And of course, we're doing Horatio Hornblower. This is one of my favorite series. Darth Plato, you've been so kind to be here while I've been looking at the series. It's absolutely one of my favorite series. And something that I think is very interesting is that it's been a while since we've done any reviews. It's probably over a month. And it is very funny because once we pick up everything with Horatio Hornblower, it's also been a while since Horatio and pretty much the entire group of sailors have been out on the sea because there's this sort of détente, or I'm not even quite sure what you would call it, between the British and the French. It is very interesting because it's almost as if the officers don't know, the officers and the sailors, they have decreased pay. Like, it's bad in the sense that they're not getting paid as much, but it's almost as if they don't know what to do with themselves when they're not at sea. And how often did they have these episodes of downtime, Darth Plato? Was this common for them to have to kind of, everybody gets brought into shore and you're commissioned 1 minute, then you're decommissioned. And then as a sailor, you don't have a job because nobody's going out doing any kind of actions. How often were people kept at port like this?
Well, there's always something to do. A ship like what you see in this episode probably had about 700 men on it, give or take. So shore leave was obviously something that they wanted, yes, but this is not an episode of shore leave. When they're going to shore, they're going on to Santo Domingo.
Right. And so am I correct in saying that they are not commissioned in the beginning of this episode, or are they
They're not what?
are they actively sailing when episode 6 starts, or are they?
Well, remember, this is the second half of the episode of 5 and 6, or part 1, part 2. So that we start off with Hornblower in the jail cell in Jamaica, and then he's explained to Pellew what happened with what's the word with mutiny. There was mutiny on the ship, and they had to sack the captain because there was a combat situation and he had lost his mind. And if you saw the last episode, we talked about this in the last episode. This episode is the consequences of those actions. The mutiny has taken place, the battle is over, they have returned to Jamaica, and they are before a board of inquiry. So that's what you see at the beginning of this episode. So
Okay, I'm thinking of the wrong episode. That's why I'm having difficulty figuring out what we're doing. Um, I thought we were doing the one after that, which was the loyalty episode, but it's okay because I
this
go to
is
my
episode
notes.
6. Episode 6.
So let me go to my retribution notes. And yeah, so the episode 5 was mutiny. Am I correct?
That episode 5 was one we did before you went on to London.
And that one was called Mutiny, right?
This was. This is what we're on now is Retribution.
Okay. So for episode, let's see. Yeah, in this one, he's actually in the jail cell, as you said, Darth Plato. And let me just pull up my notes for this one. Yeah, for some reason, I thought we were doing the next one. I thought we had already done this one, but maybe I had it scheduled and I had to cancel it. Maybe that's what I was thinking. So I hope I have the right notes here.
What I remember was you asked me if we could talk about five and then record six
Yes.
because you knew you were going to leave.
Yeah, that is
But
very true.
something came up and we weren't able to record, so we had to put it off for the entire time you were gone. So now that's why you have this long delay
Yeah,
between five and six.
it is a
But
while. It is a while.
it's a good thing we're not skipping episode six because episode six is arguably the most bombastic of all the episodes. But there's a lot of stuff going on in episode six.
There is. So let me just see if I can find my notes on this one. And you're right. It starts off where Horatio is actually in a cell.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and although it looks like, um, to be honest with you, I guess Horatio, there was consequences to be coming forward by what happened in the previous episode.
Oh yes.
There was always going to be consequences, but I'm not quite sure. Let me see if I can find it. I don't know if I can find any notes there. Let's see. Yeah, I know I have these notes out of the thousands of notes in here. So, all right. So this is what I'm going to do in regards to episode 6, Retribution. I don't know why I thought it was episode 7 for some reason. That might have been the last one that I watched was episode 7 because I thought in my mind, like what you said, I was going directly to the next episode. All right. So in Retribution, everybody's under, I don't know how many people are in prison, but from what I can gather, they're going to have to do this court martial because of what happened on the ship the last time. And ironically, it's his own captain that has to judge him. This is kind of a conflict of interest,
Captain.
isn't it?
Well, it's his former captain actually, but yes, that is true.
And so it's kind of a conflict of interest because this is the last person that he worked with prior to his last captain, who they ended up overthrowing.
But we're talking 200 years ago. They didn't really have modern standards for law. So the fact of the matter is that in a board of inquiry, you have to have ranking officers present for a command level officers to sit on the panel. You need at least 3 of them. And if there's no other person in charge, you're right. If there had been a 4th officer in charge, it's possible Pellew might not have been on the board. That's true. But he was on the board, at least for the episode. That may not have been true for real life.
Exactly. And ironically, the person that I guess Horatio was talking to, or at least it seems like, even when they're not at a point of where he's being judged or asked questions, is Pellew, who's trying to understand what happened. And of course, it's a flashback going back to, I guess, maybe 6 months of what happened on the ship. It is really interesting in a sense that, Horatio seems to find himself often on the butt end of these somewhat controversial issues. And I'm kind of curious as to whether or not any of this controversy would follow him. Like a court martial sounds very serious. Does the history of a court martial for somebody like Horatio, would that have any effect over him being able to go forward, with his commission and even become a captain himself?
I would say probably not, but maybe if there was a perception in the Navy that the wrong decision had been made, like, oh well, he got off because someone sponsoring him supported him, and he got off that way. So if that sort of perception festered, then possibly. And who knows? I didn't read the novel, so that may have been what happened because Pellew did sit on his board of inquiry.
Yeah, I didn't read the novel either, but I think it is very interesting that he is there while all this is happening. And in the flashback, we also kind of find out what happened. There's even more information about what happened when Horatio was on board. It's supposedly it's 6 months back, but I think that what's interesting is that just like any of the other actions that happens, Horatio always seems to be the person who is right in the middle of a lot of this stuff. And I don't know whether or not it's because of Horatio's attitude as a sailor. I think that we see a lot of times Horatio's attitude is that he's going to do what he thinks is fit. And even though he has to follow orders, he's not necessarily going to follow those orders and not do what he wants to do. Is some of his actions by going outside of the box or thinking outside of the box, would that be considered not following orders, even if he kind of tags it on to what he's supposed to be doing?
Well, as an aside, I think the reason why Hornblower is the center of attention is because that's how the story was written. Not to be a wise guy. Um, as far as your question goes, the reason why Horatio, okay, you're right. Disobeying the appearance of disobeying orders could be a problem, but honestly, what happened in those days was there's a significant time delay. Experienced officers knew that when you issue orders, by the time those orders arrive, the tactical situation may be completely changed. So people in those days did know that, so that was taken into consideration. So beyond that, you have to be more specific about what's going on in the episode. Now that's what the board inquiry is. It's like what did you know? When did you know it? What did the captain say? When did you learn of the orders? What did you do in response to that to those orders? And so that's really what the board inquiry is untangling all of that and figure out what you knew. So at the Battle of Copenhagen, Nelson received orders from his superior to withdraw at one point late in the battle. But Nelson knew that he had a vantage point of the battle that Lord Parker did not have. So if he withdrew, he would have been yielding initiative. So he continued against orders. And afterward, there was a look at this, and the Admiralty found that he acted correctly because of the situation. And in fact, there's a lot of battles where Nelson was in where he did that. Happened at Cape St. Vincent too, and where Lord Jervis, that was his name, Jervis, Lord Jarvis, um, also gave orders which Nelson disregarded because the tactical situation required it. Because Nelson saw something that Jarvis did not, and after the battle was over, they talked about that, and he was fine with it. Parker was not, and so there was an investigation. So that's what we're seeing here. This is now it's Horatio's time to sit in the chair and and be taken apart by the board of inquiry.
Is it presumable that um, you know people would believe that there would be something wrong with the captain? Uh, because to be honest with you, it was a little bit of a delicate situation the way that the captain kind of fell, if you will, if I remember correctly. Um, how he kind of has a fall, and it's very convenient at that point. When somebody has an accident or the doctor had this loyalty to the captain and he didn't want to report the captain, if I remember correctly. That seems to make more sense to me than anything else, that the doctor and some of the other men would be loyal. I'm kind of curious as to whether or not, in the sense that some of these mutinies, whether there is actually a whole group of people who will support the captain no matter what he does, versus the idea of, let's say, a few of the officers saying, we're not going to stand for this and we're going to decide to take over. To be honest with you, a lot of why I believe they took over was because they felt that the captain really could not do his duty. And when they did want to, there are some points when Horatio wanted to do certain things and he was told not to do it, or certain people were punished on the ship unnecessarily. Horatio was like, well, this is kind of a waste of time. It didn't really matter whether he agreed with the punishment or not. It was just like, we don't have time for this. We're supposed to be doing other stuff. And the decisions that are being made are not great decisions. But is it more likely that it would kind of be more of where a good portion of the ship, doesn't necessarily agree with a few of these officers who are kind of seeing the captain more close up, especially this captain who we kind of find out has been drugged more or less. Is the drugging even something that is affecting the captain's ability to run the ship.
That's possible, but I think the perception of the crew and especially the officers is that he does not, the captain, I mean, it does not seem to be in his right mind. And if you recall, in episode 5, the Doctor did eventually relieve the captain during the engagement with the Spanish fort because the guns could not reach the port, so their guns were not useful, and they were just sitting there on the water. So they're completely exposed, and yet the captain doesn't want to withdraw, and he breaks down, and he's hiding in that corner, not able to do anything. Well, someone has to do something because they're under fire. So Horatio does something, and the Doctor comes out and says, "Oh my God, what is this?" Okay, well, I have to relieve him. That's really all Horatio really needs to hear, and that's really all the crew needs to hear too. Now, there's tension, yes, because the crew is bifurcated. They're in their camps. There's a lot of ships that are like that. They have their cliques on the ship, and then one of the officers has his clique, and Horatio's over here. Horatio doesn't have a clique. He's just trying to do his job.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the men follow Horatio not because Horatio's their guy. He's following because they know that their chances for survival are higher if they follow him, as opposed to say Mr. Buckland. Now remember, when the captain was relieved, Horatio wasn't in command. The command fell to Mr. Buckland.
Yeah, he was, therefore the other guy was the captain when the original captain was deemed unfit.
Right, and Horatio was only the number 3 man at that point, where he was the number 4 man. So so Mr. Buckland was now the acting captain, and the number 2 man was Mr. Bush. And
yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Mr. Kennedy. Yeah, and 4 was Mr. Kennedy.
And so, one of the other things that seems to happen on the ship during this entire debacle, if you will, is that a certain portion of the crew decides to desert, like they leave. That it was a lot of them. How common would that be? I mean, being on board a sailing vessel is not easy life anyway. A lot of them were pressed into service. Was this a huge problem on a regular basis?
No, it wasn't, because the punishment for mutiny, which is so high, the punishment for desertion was so high, it's punishable by death. So, and it wasn't something that happened all the time. In the episode, it's 33 men, but 33 men out of 700. That may sound like a lot of men, but on a 700-man crew, you'd rather have those 33 men, sure, but they can still make it work. The question would really become who among the crew were among the 33 men. What skills did they possess? Was any of them officers? Was any of them the carpenter? Was any of them the boatswain? Did they have a specific skill set that couldn't be replaced? That's really where the defection of those men would really come into play. In this case, they just go to the beach, they sail to the shore, and they get shot up by the locals, and so they sort of exit the story. I think this is just the way the writers are trying to reconcile what really happened, because this story that we're talking about is actually based on a real event. Hornblower is not a real group. Yes, it is. It's based on the mutiny of the HMS Hermione.
Hermione?
That's right. The captain was Hugh Piggott. I mentioned that in the last review. So this captain, what you see in this episode, the last 2 episodes, the actions of this captain, what he does to his crew, is actually based on real events. But he was Mr. Hugh Piggott, and he wasn't crazy or medically relieved or anything like that. He was just a crazy person. The officers all wouldn't go against him, and the men, there was a mutiny, and the men killed all the officers, including Mr. Piggott. And then those men defected. And then the British had to hunt them down, and they were all hunted down, and they were all executed. What this episode is doing is they're trying to explain, well, there was a mutiny in real life, so there's a mutiny in this episode. So what happened to those men? Well, the British didn't hunt them down, so they have to be killed off. So this is how they did. They went to the shore, and they got killed off by the locals. because just to take a page out here, at this is 1802, and they're in Santo Domingo. They're on Hispaniola. I think I'm saying that right, right?
Yeah, Hispaniola
Right.
is the island name.
That's correct. Now, at that time, there was a slave outbreak led by Toussaint Louverture.
Hmm.
So that is going on at this time. So then these men sailed ashore. That the 33 deserters they ran into the free slaves.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that's how they got killed because I know when they get to, I know when at some point when Horatio and some of the other sailors leave the boat, when they get onto shore, they find, I guess maybe the remains of those deserters, on the shore because they've been killed. But I didn't know that the reason why they were killed was because they ran into a slave revolt, which is a nice twist in the story to include something like that. And of course, like Toussaint, he's kind of famous because that slave revolt is supposed to be what led to Haiti getting its freedom, right? So it's a really famous. He's a really famous. Uh, how should I say? Revolutionary, a slave
Yeah,
revolutionary.
he definitely revolutionary, that's for sure.
Now,
Much more moderate compared to the man who came after him. Monsieur Dessalines was not so moderate.
the men who are, let's say, the tribunal who are making a decision on what's going to happen with Horatio, and I guess maybe even the rest of the ship and everybody, honestly, have a certain. They're very familiar with one another. The three captains. I can't remember all their names, but they seem to have a very. They're very close, and I can't believe that they wouldn't be. They feel like they're almost kind of like-minded. So what I'm kind of curious about is when they make these decisions about what's going to happen to someone, I almost get the sense that they want to make a decision that teaches a lesson to people to not be mutinous, but also deals with the captain and deals with Horatio so they don't necessarily lose him. Are we getting a sense that that's the case, that that's the decision that they're aiming towards or trying to make in this tribunal?
I kind of get the sense that they're trying to get their minds around. And we're talking about just in the context of the story now.
Yes, yeah.
The captain who is now deceased, was nicknamed one of Nelson's own. So he had served under Nelson. So he had a certain level of prestige in the Navy because of that. And so that makes this isn't just a board of inquiry; it's a board of inquiry investigating the mutiny against a captain who is now dead,
Yes.
who was one of Nelson's own. So
Beloved, one of
that
his beloved.
one of Nelson's, yeah. So that changes things a little bit. It shouldn't, but it does. And but at the same time, these are also commissioned captains in the Royal Navy, so they have a certain duty and responsibility to get to the truth. And you see tension in the Board of Inquiry about, you know, this Mr. Hornblower, he's up to no good. He's trying to make a name for himself, and that's how I see this all playing out. And Peller's like, no, you got this all wrong. We shouldn't be talking about punishing this man. We should talk about promoting this man. That's where you see that going on. And
Yeah, and I kind of do think that they were trying to come to an amicable decision, one decision that could satisfy every single thing they wanted to achieve, which includes those three objectives, which is to keep Horatio active and not in prison, because you don't really want to court martial him. He's done a lot of good stuff for the crown. So, even if he has a misstep, let's say this was a misstep, they don't care. They want him out there active and being bold and being aggressive, fighting in a way that a lot of the other captains don't want to. So there is that. But they also don't want to make that other captain's death look bad. They don't want that to happen. But they also want to punish the deserters. In other words, they want to set a message that if you do a mutiny, we don't support this. And how do we make a decision that will satisfy all those three? So that was something that I was kind of curious about
yeah, they're
going.
they're trying to figure out, was it a mutiny or was it not? Was he legitimately relieved or was he not? Was he sick or was he not? Was he pushed into the hold or was he not? That's what they're
So
trying to figure out.
this is something that I was curious about. Personally, I think, and this doesn't make any sense, I think he fell and was pushed. I think he was on his way there, but I think that in the sense of pushing, that someone saw that he was going to fall, but they didn't stop him. So, in a sense, it's not quite a push, but it's not a save either. In other words, it was an accident that was allowed to happen. Does that make sense?
Sure, but that's not what the Board of Inquiry was asking. They were asking, was he pushed? That's what they were asking.
Yeah. So, let's say hypothetically, since you had a group of people who weren't willing to save him, I think that was quite telling. I think only the doctor was willing to kind of cover him sometimes when he could sedate him or give him something to pacify him. But even the doctor wasn't going to bother with trying to rationalize with the captain. And I think that was a very interesting sign. I think that sometimes in some of these conditions, because they are in engagements, because they're constantly going into battle, or fighting, and death is around the corner, for some people it can cause them to have a break. Like, it's not the easiest thing to deal with,
Sure.
and we just don't know. I'm not going to go ahead and say the captain you know was perfect in his decision making process. But what I was going to say is that these types of actions affect different people in different ways. And so I think that they were very careful not to necessarily say, well, this is exactly what happened. I think that when you go ahead and you present something, and you decide to not necessarily give a final decision that says, this is exactly what happened and this person is wrong or this person is right, I think it is very interesting when you make a decision like that and you decide to maybe not find the root of what happened, but kind of look at it in a conclusive way of saying, well, under the conditions, under the circumstances, from what happened, these are the decisions that were made. And when you go into this direction of making this type of a decision, um, while it is true that these things happen, the final outcome was this. And in the end, we came out okay. I mean, I think it is very interesting to weigh that. And also it is reasonable to make that type of a comment, rather than think about everything in bits and pieces, just thinking about the overall outcome of it. So while Peluz talks about whether or not you can sleep at night, I think it is very interesting how I think many of the other captains or admirals or whatever are not thinking that way. They're like, well, if you look at the final result, this is the final result. We lost a captain, but we gained this.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Do you think that
that's exactly what I was just about to say.
oh, really? Wow. Well, then please say it in your own words.
Is okay. So the captain falls down through the hole. That's true. There's now an acting captain. That's true. But there's still a mission going on. So the Board of Inquiry wants to know, well, what happened after that? Did you come back straight away, or did you fulfill your mission? Oh, you went and did your mission. Well, what did you do on your mission? How did that play out? And that's really also, that's half the episode right there. Now, this episode, honestly, is balls to the wall. Everything happens in this episode. This is a crazy episode, and everything that happens. This is what Mandalorian season 3 should have been.
Really?
Oh yeah, this is just balls to the wall. Everything happened in this episode. I love this episode. And it's just chaotic stuff. The battle itself probably is fictional. I don't know if it's based on any real engagement. It probably isn't. But it's easy to see how it could have gone down this way. They show a lot of interesting things about what the Navy would do in these real situations. Like well, we're going to park over here and we'll cross the island at dark. And when they try to retreat, then the ship comes in and bottles them into the harbor. Okay, that's perfectly reasonable. Well, we're going to use hot shot. There's a scene where they're taking cannonballs and heating them up in charcoal, making them hot as possible, and then putting that into the cannon. And that runs the risk of setting the ship on fire.
Yes.
Which helps to encourage the ships to stand down. And the Spanish commander does stand down. And of course, he has to hand over his sword. And later in the episode, remember, there's more than one mutiny. There's almost 2 mutinies here.
Yeah.
So we have the one mutiny already, but now we have the mutiny of the Spanish are now on the ship, and the Spanish commander is like, well, you're not the captain. Who are you? Oh, you're Mr. Buck. Well, who are you, Mr. Buckland? You're not even a real captain.
Yes.
And so he goes to his men, and they cook up this plot to overthrow the ship involving his wife. A rather humorous scene involving Madame, who, and of course they get loose, and there's a mutiny, and this bandits escape, and they're all over the ship, and the captain gets killed, the poor midshipman gets killed, and who comes to save the day? Mr. Hornblower.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, it is also the mission, as you mentioned, has to do with the fort. I'm assuming that it's revolves around this fort, and of course, there are so many of them in the Caribbean, where so many of these adventures, I'm going to say adventures, or legitimate actions took place. Um, and this, I know that in some cases and in some islands, a lot of these islands exchanged hands between nations back and forth a ton of times.
Yeah, which is what
So
happened in this case. Santo Domingo was under French control at that time, but the episode portrayed in Spanish for some reason.
yeah, and I know depending upon the island, it could be between the Spanish and the French, or the English and French, or whatever, any kind of combination. But these forts were so important in order for being able to raise your flag, having control of that port. So it is kind of interesting how it's handled and how important it was for them to kind of be able to take over, or have some influence on that fort, because it could mean a lot, especially to Horatio's career going forward, if he was someone who conquered here or whatever. So that was also important. Um, the other thing that I was kind of curious about too is, you know, Horatio, I think by this time, um, realizes that he's not going to be necessarily like the other captains out there. And I don't necessarily see Horatio kind of fitting into the typical captain of that age. I think a lot of the captains follow orders, and they're not going to take as many chances as Horatio does. I think that Horatio, they kind of make a joke about how, he's very bold or takes risks, but how else is he going to prove himself, especially when he's, technically speaking, started late, kind of late as a sailor. He doesn't have the same advantages as some of these other captains have with their commissions somewhat earlier in their life. Um, is his path to success, is Horatio's path to success by taking these chances something that is really achievable, or is it more, glamorized in the stories of Horatio?
Oh, I think it is glamorized. That's true. But to be fair, um, there is a very real difference in those days and now. Some officers are naturally cautious, and some officers are they're more willing to take chances. And if you take chances and you pull it off, you might get promoted because you seem, well, this is brilliant. And that's really what military history is. It's really the history of officers who took a chance and won. Now, if an officer tries to march an army across the Alps and gets stuck in a snowstorm and you have to surrender or withdraw, well, historians are gonna look at this and say, well, look at what this idiot did. But if Napoleon goes up there and crosses the Alps and goes down into Italy and hits the Austrian army when they don't expect it, that's genius. Hannibal crosses the Alps, that's genius. So it's really kind of rare. Look at the Romans used to have they used to worship fortune. They made a big deal about praying to fortune because they understood that luck was a big part of what was going on in battle. And Napoleon always said he'd rather be lucky than good. Luck really does matter, but like in poker, you're not going to win the pot if you don't bet at the pot. You have to bet at the pot. If you're just paying back, well, you're not going to win nothing. In war, it's really the same way. You have to take a chance, and a good officer knows when to take that chance when he needs to. Now, someone like a Napoleon knew how to do that because you apply a certain level of attrition, and then when the moment comes, then you maneuver. There's attrition, then maneuver. Classic Bonaparte strategy. But the Navy isn't really all that different. You wait for your opportunity to strike, and when the opportunity reveals itself, you go in. You avoid them where they're strong, hit them where they're weak. Classic strategy going back to Sun Tzu. So Horatio is a man that has very good tactical insight. He has good judgment. He can come up with stuff on the fly. That's exactly the sort of man you want. And Pelu knows this. That's exactly the sort of man you want in the Navy, as opposed to someone that's cautious. There's a place for officers that are cautious. It's not a bad thing to be cautious. You just have to know when not to be cautious, and that's really the problem. And that's why some officers, up to a certain point in their career, like say up to lieutenant commander or captain, they won't progress anymore because the promotion board looks at things like, well, this officer's too cautious.
Hmm.
And he never availed himself enough an opportunity. So look at the situation, and the and a promotion board was always going to favor someone that shows the capacity for being able to look at a situation and go, aha, this is what we can do. They always favor that. If you're just cautious all your officer career, there's going to come a point where we're not getting promoted anymore. And that's probably what Mr. Buckland probably would not have been promoted after this.
Yeah, and obviously, what's also kind of interesting is that Horatio has his influence on the other officers in this episode in particular, because they kind of disobey orders and they follow Horatio. And of course, in order for them to go ahead and progress in their careers as well, this will look good on their record versus saying, well, we didn't want to follow him because we felt his decisions were wrong. This is not the time to do that, especially with something that was maybe something they were already given orders to do anyway. But I think you know the idea that they were able to stop the Spanish prisoners from seizing the Renown was very important because it looked like that's what was going to happen. And you know, Horatio and the crew coming back uh, onto the Renown kind of thwarted that, and that was very important outcome, in the story. Uh,
And and what would Mr. Buckland doing that whole time? That's the other part of that. So Horatio take decisive action and turn the situation completely 180 degrees and averts a disaster. Mr. Buckland, what's he doing? He's tied up in his underpants. He's sitting in his cabin. That doesn't look good in the Board of Inquiry.
Yeah, it doesn't look good. And also, I think something that's really interesting is, when you're talking about the welfare of a captain, I don't necessarily think that any actions that subordinates have would have any influence over what the captain's personality or decisions are. In fact, I think it's the opposite. I think the captain makes his decisions and it has absolutely nothing to do with subordinates or any of the people who are under his command. He's already been given orders from a higher uh, authority. So it doesn't make any sense that Horatio would have pushed the captain to a breaking point or anything like that. These captains are tough as steel. You
Right,
know,
right. But that's what the captain on the Board of Inquiry was suggesting. He's like, oh, I see what's going on here. This Hornblower is trying to advance his career. He's trying to do it at the expense of Nelson's own. That's where he's coming from because he knows that officers can be ambitious. Probably because he was an ambitious officer himself, and that's where that angle is coming in. As far as officers influencing the captain, I think a good officer can influence a captain because they can have a good insight. So I think it absolutely can happen. You certainly see in battle where Jarvis observed Nelson's action, and he's like, "Well, Nelson, instead of following his orders, Nelson would and did something different." Now Jarvis doesn't just flip out and say, "Oh, he's disobeying me." He says he knows Nelson is a good subordinate. He's saying if Nelson is doing this, he must have a good reason, and so he rolls with it. And also, this happened in the Battle of the Nile. In the Battle of the Nile, Nelson had a very specific plan for how to attack the French. When they approached the French ships, Captain Foley, who was in the lead position, he was in the HMS Goliath, went and did something completely different from what Nelson expected him. Nelson saw it right away. Foley, that was his name, Mr. Foley, took his ship. Instead of going this way, he went this way. Now, Nelson doesn't panic. He thinks, Mr. Foley sees something. So rather than ordering his ships to stay on course, he signals, follow Foley. I trust my lead captain. He sees something that I don't see, and that's how the battle went. It was like it's what they call in football an audible, and it turns out Mr. Foley acted correctly. And so yes, and a subordinate can influence the captain absolutely.
Well, definitely. And I think that um, when the tribunal sees Buckland talking about how he feels um, that Horatio was responsible for the former captain's breakdown, which is what I think he was saying. Um, they actually don't even care about that. What they care about is, or at least from what I could see, what they care about is the idea that by Buckland saying this about Horatio, that it's slanderous,
Mm-hmm.
and that to go ahead and make a slanderous comment about somebody like this, someone has to answer for it. You can't just procure that out of thin air, and so it's almost as if they don't even care. It's almost as if they don't even care at this point that the captain might have been pushed to a breaking point or he was unstable. All of a sudden, what happened to the former captain has suddenly become irrelevant. Now they're more concerned, and rightfully so, I think, with what's going to happen to the surviving officers at this point. And I think that at that point, they kind of let go of at least for me, like my interpretation of it, they've kind of let go. They've assessed the situation, and now they're saying, you know what, it doesn't really matter. One person says that he was pushed, one person says this. It was late at night. There are all other circumstances. We don't even care about that anymore. How are we going to deal with somebody making such slanderous accusations against another officer? Because the last time somebody made an accusation against Horatio, it ended up in a duel, right, Darth Plato?
Yeah, well, that's a bit of a different situation because he was being singled out by that guy who was just he was just a piece of work that just wanted to hurt people. He was a bully, he just wanted to hurt people. That's what his deal was. The captain was a little different though. The captain was an experienced line officer. He's an experienced line officer who was literally losing his mind. And Mr. Buckland is trying to advance his career on that. He is absolutely trying to advance. Like you just mentioned it. Is
Yes.
Mr. Buckland lies in the tribe in the board of inquiry about Hornblower? What does he lie about? He says Mr. Hornblower was the one who pushed the captain, and he knows that's false. And he wants to get the doctor to come in and back him up because he knows the doctor doesn't like Hornblower because he doesn't, and the Hornblower didn't back him up. And that's the end of Buckland's career. Why did Buckland do that? Because, like Mr. Simpson in the first episode, Mr. Buckland, although he may not be a physical bully, he's not pushing people around physically, he's nevertheless a bully. He's trying to get this Mr. Hornblower accused of a crime he didn't do and possibly hanged because of it.
Hmm.
Mr. Buckland is what they use polite language, a piece of work.
Now, the final question that I have, and I think it is very interesting that at this moment, there's this situation where it seems like somebody kind of steps in and intervenes this unexpected player. I think it was unexpected. I wasn't expecting this to happen during the tribunal. Has to do, of course, with Archie saying that I guess more or less he decides to take blame for the death of the captain, and I didn't see that coming from a mile away.
And it wouldn't have been necessary if Mr. Buckland had not said anything. That's the tragedy of the whole thing. Um, Look at Mr. Kennedy. Probably Mr. Kennedy was mortally wounded. He was going to die anyway, so that would not be helped. So he wasn't hanged. He just died. The problem is Mr. Kennedy now has the stigma on his career forever. He will always be remembered in the Navy as the man who assaulted his captain. He'll always be remembered for that. And Hornblower, he knows that's false and he can't do anything about it. And why did it happen? Because that piece of dirt, Mr. Buckland, wanted to advance his career.
Yeah, it's very dangerous. The fact that anybody can even have that type of influence, or someone's word can go that far. there. And I think Buckland must not have been happy with that outcome. He's looking at it as, well, they won't believe me if I pull up another accusation against Hornblower. So my chance to kind of slander him and get him in trouble is gone. At least that's how I kind of look at it, because traditionally this would have been something that Hornblower would have had to respond to,
Yeah,
and would have been.
there might have been another duel. I'm surprised there wasn't another duel. That's the sort of thing you duel over. And I think that, and by the way, that's why dueling existed in the past. It didn't exist because it was a less civilized society, although people say that. It existed because there had to be some sort of recourse for people to protect their reputation. Because it was very easy for someone of station, someone with money, to just say, well, this is what happened. And he's completely lying. And so there had to be some sort of recourse. But you couldn't take people to court in those days for slander. You can now, but in those days you couldn't. So, hey, that's not what happened, and you knew it. I challenge you to a duel. That's why they had that in those days.
Yeah, well, this was certainly a very complicated situation, and I think that although it is a miracle that Archie came forward and did that,
Yeah.
I think it's very atypical that you would see somebody willing to take the fall for something like that, even though he's technically speaking, let's say on his deathbed, or doesn't has mortal wounds, if you will. It still was quite shocking to see him decide to take the fall for that, going forward, and I guess Horatio was very, very lucky to have friends and coworkers.
Duty, honor, sacrifice. That's what that's what the military is all about. Duty, honor, sacrifice. We serve, we go, we experience this, we do what we do so that you, not you personally, but so that you, the common people, the people who are your family, for instance, you don't have to. I will take up this challenge so you don't have to. That's what the whole point of service is: duty, honor, sacrifice. So honestly, I don't think it's a surprise that Kennedy does take this fall. I mean, granted, he is mortally wounded, so he's going to die anyway. I think it might have been a more powerful scene if he hadn't been mortally wounded and he would hang for what he said. That might have been a more powerful scene.
Yeah,
But
because in the story you could see them getting the gallows ready, right? Like it looks like somebody's going to be hung any minute, and then when that doesn't happen, you're kind of like, oh, no one's going to hang necessarily for this, at least not right now. It was a bit of a surprise to see the final outcome of this, and of course, Horatio ends up getting promoted, and becomes, I guess, a captain, or
he's a commander.
oh, he's a commander. Okay,
Okay.
so.
But the officer in charge of the ship is always called the captain, even if he doesn't possess the rank of captain.
Okay, okay. So he gets promoted to commander,
Right?
and gets his own ship. Ironically, the name of the ship is called the Retribution, from what they're saying, which is very funny.
It was renamed the Retribution. That's correct.
Yeah, so that's very funny, that it's called Retribution.
Just a comment about the Navy. Ship complements and who commands these complements is determined by how many men are on the ship. So a small ship, like say less than 50 men, would be commanded by a lieutenant. So even though he's just a lieutenant, he's still the skipper. He's still the captain. They call him the captain, but he's just a lieutenant. So, for example, JFK, when he served in the Navy, he commanded a torpedo boat, and he was the captain of the boat, and so he had men call him the skipper. And then it goes up. So 50 men, 100 men, 150 men. I'm not sure how it breaks down exactly. So 150 men. I think it's 250. If you command a ship that has more than 250 men, then you have to be a captain by rank in order to get that command. I believe that's how it works.
And my final question is, what would the outcome have been if Pellew was not on this tribunal?
It might have been the same. It might have, but you're right. There's no way to know how the board would have been influenced if he hadn't been there. There's no way to know. On the other hand, it's possible that the tribunal might have gone a different direction if you had, instead of one officer, you had two officers who were sitting there going, "Hey, this Hornblower guy, I think he's trying to promote his own career, and I don't believe him for 1 second. No way, I don't believe." It's possible you can talk yourself into You can talk yourself into a conviction before hearing all the evidence. That's entirely possible. You just nobody know. The fact of the matter is, Pelly was there, at least for the episode is concerned, and that's how it played out.
Yeah, I think it is very interesting. You are right about this episode having a lot of action in it,
Great
and
episode.
it was a very good episode because it had action in it, and it also had to deal with the captain situation. You know, like let's say now if this whole thing with the captain hadn't happened. Let's say they didn't have a mutiny and they were still able to execute the action even with the captain. I think that captain would have kind of gotten in the way of a lot of things
Sure.
if he wasn't subdued. You
If,
know, he
if he had to be relieved at some point, it's just as well it happened when it did.
Yeah, I think he would have pretty much prevented a lot of the officers from even moving around. He in particular liked controlling the soldiers, but all the sailors, but also the officers. You know, in particular that poor young officer. I mean, he does end up dying
Yeah,
in the
nature.
episode too, but he also gets controlled quite a bit by the captain's influence. And so overall, you know, that captain really had a deleterious effect on a lot of the officers on that ship. It really was kind of like a survivor episode. Who was going to make it off that ship without getting pulled down by the captain's actions? And that's how I kind of view it. There was a lot of this repercussions that the captain kind of pulled down a lot of people, a lot of these sailors and officers in a very negative way.
Right.
And being able to navigate that is a success, which not all of them could do and make it out alive.
You could arguably say this is the best episode because think about it. There's a lot of think about the wide range of emotion that takes place in this episode. There's a lot of different emotions. So you watch the episode from beginning to end and write down what emotion is taking place here, and then just keep writing them down. By the end of the episode, we're going to have a long list of stuff.
Yeah, you certainly are. It is very impressive what they were able to do, you know, in this particular episode and how much was going on. Um, Also historically how significant the episode was, and pretty typical action trying to capture a fort and trying to especially in the Caribbean and in areas where you do have slaves, where there are these slave revolts and dealing with that as well. So it did have a lot of exciting action, seeing the slaves kind of saying, hey.
It's like a
You know,
three-way battle. Yeah.
yeah, it was extraordinary in that regard. So I think you're right about that. A lot of the forces that were present, especially in the Caribbean at the time we saw, and that really does make it, I think, really spectacular episode. So I enjoyed this episode very much. And Darth Plato, I want to thank you for joining me to talk about the episode 6 of Horatio Hornblower.
Okay.
Um,
I just wanted to take this moment to say hello to everyone in the chat. I don't have the chat up, so I can't see who's here. But
oh,
hello to everybody here. If Tom Junior Jackson is here, I just want to say hello, Tom, and thank you for inviting me.
yes, Tom is here. Thank you so much, Tom, for being here. As always, collaborator, moderator, and friend. We are all goof people. Thank you, Tom, for the continued support, as well as everybody in the chat for this series that I absolutely love, Horatio Hornblower. Blower. And Dr. Plato, where can people find you?
Well, you can find me right here on the channel. You can find me on well, I don't have a YouTube channel, but I do have a presence on YouTube. You can send me a private message if you want. Um, but my usual haunts are Positive Fandom, the It Show, and of course Rob's show, Robert Martyr Burnett, formerly known as Roberto.
Absolutely, guys. And of course, you can find me here on Positive Fandom on the Burnettwork as well, on Lorraine Creel's channel and the 1/6 Scale Man Network. Darth Plato and I are going to be continuing to review this series. We're going to continue with a lot of series coming forward.
2 more episodes.
2 more episodes, episodes 7 and 8, to finish Horatio Hornblower. There's Oppenheimer coming up, which Darth Plato and I are going to be reviewing here and on the Burnettwork, as well as Napoleon, both here and on the Burnettwork. We're going to be reviewing those movies and talking about more historical films coming up, historical films and television. So do please check out our series thank you guys for being here, for supporting um, this part of the show, as well as the previous 5 episodes. We're on at this time. This is the new time for this particular show. I so love doing historical reviews with Darth Plato. We just love this stuff, and I hope you do too. Tom Jr. Jackson, thank you so much as always. And guys, just remember, no matter where you are in the galaxy, always remember to please be kind. Take care, everybody. I lost my promo.